1 second, gotta get rid of the cat. Hi, I'm Jennifer, the Inquiring Quilter. Welcome to this episode of Intelligent Quilting, where we discuss the tricks and the traps of various quilting methods. Today, the topic is no-waste flying geese. The no-waste method results in 4 identical flying geese, which is perfect for quilts like this one here, where you're making a sawtooth star and all 4 flying geese have to be the same color. It's called no waste because, well, as you'll see, you don't really have a lot of wasted fabric like you would in other methods like the stitch and flip method. Let's get down to the math. You will need a single square of fabric. That's the goose fabric, and then 4 sky squares. And to remind you, when you're looking at a flying geese, this is the goose unit and this is the sky. So that's how you choose your fabrics. With the no waste method, the math is perhaps a little bit, mathematical. For your big square, you will need to cut, let's say I wanted to make 2-inch by 4-inch flying geese finished. The goose square, you add 1 1/4 inches to the width. So I've got 4 inches, I'm adding 1 1/4, so I get 5 1/4. So my square is going to be 5 1/4 inches. That's not too tough. The sky squares are, you take the finish height of your desired flying geese unit, and you add 7/8. So I've got a 2-inch finished height, and I'm adding 7/8. So I'm cutting 2 7/8, which is kind of, I kind of would rather cut 3 inches, but don't, because if you do that, your flying geese units really won't come out right. The proportions are perfect here. So you've got to do 5 1/4 inch and 2 7/8. To help you cut, let me show you a trick. I will mark, since 7/8 is one of those things that I don't necessarily remember, I will use this. This is called a sew line tape. I will lay it right across or near the 7/8 line. So when I'm trying to cut, it's real easy to know, oh yeah, that's where I've got to cut. I've got this lined up on that fabric, so I can trim here and I'll have a perfect 2 7/8. I've seen some people take tape, put it on the back of their ruler, and even in multiple layers to create kind of a little thing that you can bump up against, and that really speeds up having to cut such an odd number. I have also heard, and I don't have this problem when I'm making the 4 at a time flying geese, but if they're not coming out perfect for you, if they're not coming out to size, you can bump these measurements up. You can add 1/4 inch to everything. So you can cut, in this case, your goose fabric would be cut at 5 1/2 inches, and your sky squares, instead of 3 1/8, you could make it 3 1/4. That's an easier number to cut. So, and they will come out good. They'll just be oversized and you'll have to trim them down. I will include, by the way, in the description of this video, a free download, a link to a free download, which will include all the cutting sizes, the size that you need to cut your goose and your fabric, your goose and your sky fabric, so that you don't have to do the math. For this one, it is a little complicated math. For the stitch and flip method, it's rather easy to keep in your head, but it will include the cutting measurements for all the various different methods for making flying geese. So watch for that in the video description. Also, any of the tools that I discuss in this video will also be linked in the video description so that you can find them online. Now that we know what size to cut our goose squares and our sky squares, with this method you do mark. So let me show you. And you mark on the back of your sky squares. I am using a sandboard here because it will hold my fabric in place and keep it from slipping as I'm marking. Especially important, you know, that it doesn't, so you can get your mark straight from corner to corner, because that's what you're going to do. Now you do have a couple of choices here. You can mark corner to corner, or you can mark your sewing lines, and it is better for you to mark your sewing lines with this method. So I'm going to use, these are my Fons and Porter 1/4 inch seam markers. There's something similar here. This is called the Quilters rule. It has a little notch in it, so you can mark the seam line if you want to, the diagonal line. But in this case, I'm just going to mark the 2 sewing lines. And there's a yellow line that runs down the middle of the 1/4 inch seam marker, and I just put that in the corners, and then I just use a simple mechanical pencil for some light fabrics like this. I'm just going to drag it down on either side, and I'm marking the sewing lines. So now I have to repeat this for each of my sky squares, but for right now I'll just mark one more. As you can see, I'm going to use the shorter one here. These rulers come in 2 different sizes. The 1/4 inch seam markers come in 2 different sizes so that you can have one that's the right size for the squares that you're trying to mark. The other one is really large and is good when you're making larger flying geese. So now that I have these marked, let's show you how you set it up for sewing. Take it, put it in the corner. In other words, this was cut at the 5.5 inch size so that I could use oversized squares and then trim down. Okay, got that. So notice placing these both in the corner, your lines will line up and they will overlap just a tiny bit. Now this overlap does cause just a tiny bit of additional fabric in this corner. I don't typically worry about that, but if you're hand quilting, it could be kind of a worry. So what you could do, if you wanted to, you could draw a line just right at that intersection there. And then you could take your scissors and cut just through just the 2 sky fabrics. And by trimming those off, you'll eliminate this little extra bit of bulk and this little extra bit of bulk in that seam. And this is where the geese is going to come together, the point. So eliminating a little bit of extra fabric may help you achieve perfection. And so the extra time that you take to do that may be worth it. I don't typically bother, but it is definitely a tip that I wanted to pass on to you because I think it's a good one. So now that I have these marked, I'm ready to go to the sewing machine. So why don't you join me there? We have our squares marked and we've got them pinned, so it's time to sew. And this method is pretty brainless as far as that part's concerned. You have marked the sewing lines, so that's what you're going to do. You're just going to sew on the sewing lines. And then you simply turn it around and sew on the other line. So let me do that. Then I'll show you what we need to do next. Again, sewing on a line is pretty brainless. No worrying about that perfect 1/4 inch here. We've already marked it. And we're ready for the next step. But before we get there, what I've done is I've taken the diagonal seam tape by Cluck Cluck Sew. This is what it looks like. And I've attached it in front to my the bed of my sewing machine in front of my needle. You take the red line that runs down the middle of the tape, make sure that's directly in front of your needle, and then on either side you'll notice these two black lines. They are exactly 1/4 of an inch away, and so that's awesome for sewing without having to mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the point of my first square and put it on the black line. That means my needle will then be 1/4 inch away, which is exactly what I want, right? I want to sew 1/4 inch away from this point to this point. So that's what I'm going to do. Just run the corner point of my sky square along that red line. And down at this end, I am making sure that my point of my square is running along the bottom of that tape. And let me get this out of the way. That helps me maintain that distance. And so exactly 1/4 of an inch away from the point. And now let me take this. This is my ender. You can also use a laser to sew without marking, and I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes. Now I want to sew the second side here. So let's see. I need to, this always gets me there. I need to put my point, I need to turn this around, put my point on the black line again, and start sewing. And that will keep me sewing exactly 1/4 inch away from that center line. And down here I keep my bottom corner exactly lined up, and that gives me that. So there you go. And we have our two flying geese. Set one aside. So you've sewn on your sewing lines or with the no mark method, and you've got your two lines here. So first let's press those flat. I always like to press to set my seams before the next step. Okay, now that I've got that nice and flat, let me take you over to my cutting table. Hi, we've sewn our flying geese for the first step, 1/4 inch away from that diagonal line, or we've marked our sewing lines and sewn on those, or we've used the no mark method with the diagonal seam tape or the laser to sew. So that's where we are now. Let me show you the next step. At this point, I like to press to set the seams, and then I'm going to cut in between from corner to corner. And I need to go to the pressing station, but what I'm going to be doing, just to give you a preview, pressing these up like that. And that's going to give me 2 heart units, and then I'm ready for the next step. So join me at the pressing station. Hi, we're at the pressing station now. We've cut our units apart, and now we're going to press them. So what you're doing is you're finger pressing the sky fabric up and pressing it with a hot iron. You can also use the nose of your iron to help nudge that over, however you prefer. I prefer using a wool pressing mat because it will get them nice and flat. You're going to end up with something that's kind of like a heart unit. Let me continue pressing these. When you do this, you will end up with 2 heart units, and then you need to go to the sewing machine. But I did this twice. I did this by marking the lines, and then by not marking the lines, as I showed you how to do with the diagonal seam tape or a laser. So that's why I've got 4s, because I've made 2 sets. Okay, now that we have our heart units, we're ready to go to the next step. So we've marked our square and we put it on the heart unit. Make sure you're lining up the edges here and pinning. Just one pin will do. And now I'm ready to sew on those lines that I've marked. Remember, the lines were marked a 1/4 inch away from the line that runs point to point on the sky square. I am sewing onto a ender here, and when I turn this around to sew the other line, smooth that up just a little bit, that will become my leader. And it's important to use those, as I'll probably mention again and again, because you're sewing onto a point here, and there's not anything for the feed dogs to grab hold of, so having a scrap of fabric under your needle as you start will really help provide you with a nice smooth seam without any thread nests. So again, I just turned it around and I'm sewing on the other line, and then I'll sew onto this. So remember, we started with a big square, we sewed 2 things onto the big square, we cut that square apart and ended up with 2 heart units. I've sewn this one, this sky square had the lines marked. Let me show you how you can save some time by using either a laser or the diagonal seam tape to sew these seams without having to mark that sky fabric. I've got my diagonal seam tape lined up correctly. The red is lined up in front of the needle, and then the 2 black lines are a 1/4 inch away from that, and they're going to be my guides for sewing without marking. So I'm going to use the point of my fabric, the corner of the sky fabric, and take that, run that along the black line, and that's going to make sure that my needle is a 1/4 inch away from that point to point intersection. Again, with the diagonal seam tape, you just keep this corner of your sky fabric running along that black line, and you'll be sewing a 1/4 inch away from the point to point. By the way, it is important that you use leaders and enders with the fast Flying Geese method. The reason is because you are sewing, unlike normal stitching where you're sewing onto a flat square edge where the feed dogs have something to grab hold of, you're pointing your fabric this way and there's very little for it to grab hold of. So sewing onto this first and then gently leading this under the needle will prevent you from getting thread nests and will give you a better seam. So now that I've sewn this on, it's time to cut apart, and I will have 2 Flying Geese from this heart unit and 2 from the others that I sewed earlier. This is my sewing machine laser, and you may have seen it in some other videos. And in the intro to the various ways in which you can use, you can make Flying Geese, I did mention that the laser, and I showed it on camera. But let me show you here again. It is attached to the top of my machine with a bit of Velcro. and there is a switch on the side where I can turn it on and off as needed. You can position this laser beam wherever you want. So I have my laser set up, and I'm going to use it with the no mark method to sew this last sky square on. I line up the point of that sky square with my laser, and I'm keeping the other end down here aligned with the laser as well. That ensures that, because I've set up my laser to be 1/4 inch away from my needle, that means by following the laser, making that be my corner to corner line, I will get a seam that is 1/4 inch away from the center line. So onto a ender here. Hi, we're back from sewing, and now you should have 2 heart-shaped units with a sky square shown on them. So now what do? Well, we cut them apart and press, because we are at the last part of this journey. So I'm going to cut from corner to corner on that sky square, and here cut corner to corner on the sky square. There we go. Now meet me at the pressing station for the final victory lap. So we're back at the pressing station, and we have our 4 flying geese, and now all we have to do is press. So we've got this final sky square. I will finger press first and then flatten with my iron. Don't know if I've mentioned it yet. I like to use an iron that's set on cotton, no steam. I don't want steam because steam may stretch my fabrics, may skew them out of shape, and I'd rather control that by spraying with water when I need it. Again, just finger press that over and then press down. I have a wool pressing mat as well, and that helps really press things flat. There we go. So now we've got our 4 flying geese, and we just need to trim them up to size, removing the dog ears and making sure that they're the right size. So meet me at the cutting table. Hi, we're back from pressing, and now we're about to take our victory lap and trim these flying geese up to size. Or at least verify that they're the right size. Let's see, I was making 2 by 4 inch finished flying geese, so they should measure 2.5 by 4.5. What I like to do is, since 2.5 by 4.5, 4.5 divided by 2 is 2 1/4. So I will take this 2 1/4 inch mark and put it at the point of my intersection where the sky and the geese meet. That way I'm trimming, if I'm trimming anything at all, I'm trimming the equal amount from both sides of this rectangle. Notice I like to use a rotary cutting mat. That helps me trim without lopping off my fingers. Oh, by the way, I also put the 2.5 inch mark at the base of this rectangle because my flying geese happen to be 2.5 by 4.5. So I will repeat the process, this time putting my 2.5 inch mark right there, and my 4.5 inch mark right here, and my 2.5 inch mark there. There. 2 1/4 right here at the point, 4.5 right here on that freshly cut edge, 2.5 down here on this freshly cut edge, and we'll see if there's anything I still need to lop off. There we go. So we have one 2.5 by 4.5 inch Flying Geese unit, and I just need to trim up the rest of these, and I'll have 4 fast flying geese. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please like it, and if you like the way I teach, please follow me on YouTube, and you'll be notified the next time I make a video. Also, as a reminder, in the description of this video is a link to a free download, which will give you the math for the fast flying geese. I'll also include the math if you decide that you want to cut your squares bigger and trim off a little bit more. When you're first learning this method, that is a good way to go. I do not tend to do that because it seems to work fine for me with the regular measurements, but adding an extra 1/4 inch is not wasting very much fabric, and if it will ensure that at the end you end up with 4 flying geese the right measurement rather than 4 flying geese that are now scrap fabrics, it's worth it. So again, the link to that download is in the video description, along with links to the various tools that I've used throughout this process so that you can pick them up for yourself if that's something you'd like to do. So see you next time. Bye.